Part 2 of Rebels of the Red Planet by Charles L Fontenay, read by Mark Douglas Nelson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Rebels of the Red Planet, Chapter 3. Maya's education was extensive, but it did not include the genetic sciences. She was able to follow Goat's explanations and his references to the charts he hung, one after another, on the wall of his study, but she was able to follow them only in a general sense. The technical details escaped her. Newell seemed to have a better grasp of the subject. He nodded his dark, curly head frequently, and occasionally asked a question or two. "Surgery is performed with a concentrated electron stream on the cells of the early embryo," said Goat. "I call it surgery, but actually it is an alteration of the structure of certain specific genes which govern the characteristics I am attempting to change. Such changes would, of course, then be transmitted on down to any progeny. The earlier the embryo is caught, the easier and surer the surgery, because when it has divided into too many cells, the very task of dealing with each one separately makes the time requirement prohibitive, besides multiplying the chance for error. The Martians have a method of altering the physical structure and genetic composition of a full-grown adult, but this is far beyond the stage I've reached." "The Martians?" repeated Newell in astonishment. "You mean the Martian natives? They're nothing but degenerated animals." "You're wrong," replied Goat. "I know that's the general opinion, but I had considerable contact with them a good many years ago. Perhaps most of them are little more than strange animals. No one really knows. They live simple, animal-like lives, holed up in desert caves, and they're rarely communicative in any way. But I know from my own experiences that some of them, at least, are still familiar with that ancient science that they must have possessed when Earth was in an earlier stage of life than the human." "This child that brought us the wine is one of the products of your experiments?" asked Newell. "Yes. Petway's pretty representative of the children, I'm afraid. I've been trying to determine what went wrong. It could be an inaccuracy in dealing with the genetic structure itself, or a failure to follow exactly the same pattern of change in moving from one cell to another in the embryo. If I could only catch one at the single-cell stage. None of the children has turned out as well as my first two experiments, Brute and Adam. Both of them were born about 25 years ago, terrestrial years, that is, and developed into normal, even superior physical specimens. Unfortunately, their mental development was retarded. Adam was the brighter of the two, and Brute killed him tonight, shortly before your arrival." Maya shivered. "Somehow it seems horrible to me, experimenting with human lives this way," she said. "It's being done for a good cause, Maya," said Newell. "Dr. Hennessy's objective is to help man live better on Mars. After all, there is nothing nobler than the individual sacrifice of himself for his fellows, whether it's voluntary or involuntary." "But what about the mothers of these children?" asked Maya. "The big problem is to reach them as soon as possible after conception," said Goat, misinterpreting her question. "We do this by magnetic detectors, which report instantly the conjunction of the positive and negative. The surgery is performed as quickly as possible, utilizing the suspended animation technique which is being developed toward interstellar travel." "I wasn't asking about the technical aspects," said Maya. "What I want to know is, what sort of mothers will permit you to experiment this way on their unborn children, especially seeing the results you've already obtained?" Goat started to answer, but Newell forestalled him. "There are some things that are none of your business, darling," he said. "The terrestrial government sent you here on a specific assignment, and I don't think you should inquire into matters which are classified as secret by the local government, which don't have anything to do with that assignment. Now, Dr. Hennessy, Just what sort of survival qualities have you been able to develop in these experiments?" "There's no witchcraft involved," retorted Goat, with a sardonic grimace. "I haven't accused you," said Newell quickly. "No, but I keep up with events, even out here, well enough to know that you're the Mars City government's chief nemesis where there's any suspicion of extrasensory perception. I doubt that you chose to make this trip yourself without reason, Mr. Eli." "It's merely a routine inspection," murmured Newell. Goat indicated one of his charts, showing a diagram of genes and chromosomes in different colors. "This is my original chart," he said. "I copied it from one belonging to the Martians many years ago, and my genetic alteration of Brute and Atom were based on it. But I must have miscopied it, or else the Martians didn't have the objective I thought they did in it, because I could find no alteration of genes affecting lung capacity or oxygen utilization. My own subsequent charts, on which later experiments were based, are alterations of this." "But just what is your objective, and how well have you succeeded?" persisted Newell. "Ability to survive under Martian conditions." "I know. This is stated in all previous inspection reports. I want something more specific." "Why, ability to survive in an almost oxygen-free atmosphere, of course. As well as can be determined, the Martians do this by deriving oxygen from surface solids and storing it in their humps under compression, very much like an oxygen tank. I've succeeded to some degree with my children. All of them can go an hour or two without breathing. What I don't understand is that no capacities like that were included in the genetic changes on Atom and Brute, and yet they've gradually developed an ability to do much better. Both of them were out on the desert the entire day today without oxygen." Newell was silent for a moment, tapping the tips of his fingers together, apparently in deep thought. Then he said, "Maya, I think we've reached the point where you had better retire to your room, and let us to talk privately. You can question Dr. Hennessy in the morning about any attempts the rebels may have made to contact him." Maya obeyed silently, rather glad to get away and think things over alone. When she had come to Mars as an agent of the Earth government, it had not occurred to her that there would be areas of information from which the local government would bar her. She recognized that such a prohibition was perfectly valid, but she was a little offended nevertheless. Her room was a spacious one on the ground level, and boasted one of ultra-virus few large windows. Maya unpacked her bag and gratefully stripped off her boots and socks, her tunic and baggy trousers. In underpants, she went into the small bathroom, washed cosmetics from her face, and brushed down her thick, short hair. Donning her light sleeping garment, she sat down on the edge of her bed. She was very tired from the long drive, and, almost without thinking, she did not get up to turn out the light. She thought at it. The switch clicked, and the light went out. She felt foolish and a little frightened. She had never told Newell of this sort of thing. Can a woman ask her witch-hunting lover, "Do you think I'm a witch?" With almost total recall, as though she had heard it spoken, she remembered the summation speech Newell had made the first time she had seen him in action. He was prosecuting a man charged with conducting experiments similar to the historic and outlawed Rhine experiments of Earth. "Gentlemen, we sit here in a public building and conduct certain necessary human affairs in a dignified and orderly manner. We follow a way of life we brought with us from distant Earth. Apparently, we are as safe here as we would be on Earth. I say apparently. Sometimes we forget the thin barriers here that protect us against disaster, against extermination. A rent in the city's dome, a failure in our oxygen machinery, a clogging of our pumping system by the ever-present sand, and most of us would die before help could reach us from our nearest neighbors. We live here under certain restrictions that many of us do not like. Certainly, no one likes to be unable to step out under the open sky without wearing a bulky Mars suit and an oxygen tank. Certainly, no one likes to be rationed on water and meat throughout the foreseeable future. But what we have to remember is that absolute discipline has always been a requirement for those courageous souls in the vanguard of human progress. Witchcraft, the practice of extrasensory perception, if you prefer the term, is forbidden on Mars because to practice it one must differ from his fellow men when the inexorable dangers of our frontier demand that we work together. To practice it, one must devote time and mental effort to untried things when our thin margin of safety makes concentrated and combined effort necessary for survival. That is why witchcraft is forbidden on Mars. Let those who yet cling to the wistful liberalism of Earth label us conformists if they will. I say to you that until Mars is won for humanity, we cannot afford the luxury of nonconformity. Gentlemen, I give you the prosecution's case." Maya stared out the window. This whole side of Ultravirus was dark, except for a rectangle of light cast from a window a little distance away, the window of Goat Hennessy's study. In this rectangle, the red sand of the desert lay clear and stark. Near the end of the rectangle lay an indistinct, crumpled, oblong figure. Puzzled, Maya studied it. It looked like a body to her. In the study, Newell gazed at the skinny doctor with angry brown eyes. "The bulletin sent to you, as well as other researchers, gave specific instructions that research was to be directed toward human utilization of certain foods now being developed," accused Newell. "I thought this was more important," replied Goat. "You thought? You're not on Earth, where scientists can get government grants and go jaunting off on wild research projects of their own." "I still think this is more important," said Goat stubbornly. "I know that all of us are expected to cooperate and stick to tried and accepted lines so we won't be wasting time and material. Perhaps I was wrong in not doing that initially. But now I've proved that this line of research can be followed profitably, so its continuance now can't be looked on as a waste of time." "Scientists should leave political direction to more experienced men," said Newell in an exasperated tone. "This is not merely a matter of time waste or nonconformity. The Mars Corporation operates our sole supply line to Earth, Dr. Hennessy, and that supply line brings to man on Mars all the many things he needs to live here. The Earth-Mars run is an expensive operation, and it's important that it remain economically feasible for Mars Corp to operate it. No matter how altruistic you may be about it, you get man to the point that he doesn't depend on atmospheric oxygen here, and domes, pressurized houses, and ground cars, oxygen equipment, a great many things are going to be unnecessary. But there'll still be a lot of other things we'll have to have from Earth. Don't you realize what a disaster it would be if Mars Corp decided to drop the only spaceship line to Earth because its cargo fell off to the point that it was economically unsound?" Goat looked at him with shrewd blue eyes. "I think I can jump to a conclusion," he remarked mildly. "Mars Corp has some sort of control over the foods you're trying to make practical for human consumption in the approved experiments, doesn't it?" "Well, yes. Mars Corp wants to make man gradually self-sufficient on Mars, and I think it's legitimate that Mars Corp derives some economic benefits from its efforts in that direction." "I've wondered for some time just how close Mars Corp and the government were tied together," said Goat dryly. "Obviously, if I don't do as you say, my supplies here will be cut off, so I have no choice but to discontinue this work and turn my attention to the approved line." "That isn't quite adequate now," said Newell. "You're going to have to leave here and come to Mars City, where you can do your research under supervision. Your experimental humans here will be destroyed, of course." Destroyed? There was an agonized note to Goat's voice. All of them? How about the 2 mothers I have who haven't given birth yet? You destroy them anyhow, as you have the others, not long after the births. And that brings up another thing. When you get to Mars City, watch your tongue. You almost revealed to Miss Karen Nome that the government has been kidnapping an expected mother now and then for your experiments. Years of work gone to waste, mourned Goat somberly. When must I do this? As soon as possible. You'll be expected in Mars City within 2 weeks. Now, I'd like to see these experimental humans. A few moments later, they made their way together through a large dormitory in which all of Goat's charges were sleeping. Newell shuddered at the sight of the small, deformed bodies. I don't worry that you could ever take any of these to Mars City undetected. But, he said, pointing to Brute, that one looks too near normal. I want to see him destroyed before I leave. Brute? But he's the most successful one I have left. Exactly. That's why I want to see him destroyed tonight. Goat awoke Brute, and the monster man sleepily followed them back to the study. Goat picked up the huge knife, still stained with Adam's blood, and looked Brute squarely in the face. Brute returned the gaze, no comprehension in his dull blue eyes. "You think I can't kill you, Brute?" said Goat coldly. "I'll show you." With a surgeon's precision, Goat plunged the sharp point between Brute's ribs and into the heart. Shock swept over Brute's mind. "Father kills me! Reject! Reject! Father, all kindness, all hope, all wisdom and love, wants me no more. Father rejects me. Father kills me. Despair! Reject! Reject!" Blackness swept fading through Brute's despairing brain. One agonized note of pleading in the pale blue eyes, and they closed in acceptance. Brute swayed and fell forward, crashing to the floor, driving the knife into his chest to the hilt. Brute shuddered and rolled over on his back. He lay sprawled, arms flung out limply, the knife hilt protruding upward. He sighed, and his breathing stopped. Goat stared down at him. He picked up Brute's wrist and held it. There was no pulse. Shortly after dawn, Maya awoke. Remembering what she had seen dimly the night before, she went curiously to the window. There were 2 of them now. They were bodies, human bodies, naked and unquestionably dead. In the night, the dry, vampirish Martian air had desiccated them. They were skeletons, parchment skin stretched tightly over the lifeless bones. Even as she stood and looked, a group of figures appeared on the horizon and came slowly nearer. They were Martians, monstrous creatures, huge-chested, hump-backed, with tremendously long, thin legs and arms, their big-eyed, big-eared heads mere excrescences in the front of their humps. Trailing slowly through the desert toward Aurora Sinus, they passed near the skeletons' bodies. One of the Martians saw them. He boomed excitedly at the others, loudly enough for Maya to hear through the double window. The Martian stopped and gathered around the bodies. What, she wondered, could interest them in 2 corpses? There was no guessing. Martian motives and thought processes were alien and incomprehensible, even to one who had lived among them and communicated with them as a child. One of the Martians picked up one of the corpses, and the whole group moved away toward the lowland, the Martian carrying the body easily with one long-fingered hand. Wisps of sandy dust trailed them as they dwindled and slowly vanished. The second body lay where they had left it. A gaping wound in its throat seemed to mock her. Chapter 4. Fancher Ladigan made his way down a long, dim corridor in the rear portion of the Childress Barber College, in Mars City's eastern quarter. He stopped and hesitated with some trepidation before an unmarked door near the end of the corridor. Completely bald, bespectacled, and well up in years, Fancher looked like a clerk, and he had the instincts of a clerk. Yet he utilized that appearance and those instincts in a perilous cause. Fancher knocked timidly on the door. On receiving an indistinct invitation from inside, he pushed it open and entered. Fancher had a tendency to shiver every time he had the occasion to see the chief, whose real name was unknown to Fancher and to most others here at the Barber College. Small as a child in body, wagging a thin-haired head larger than life-size, the chief surveyed Fancher with icy green eyes. The eyes were large and round as a child's, but there was nothing childlike about their expression. As though to deny his physical smallness, he smoked one of the fragrant, foot-long cigars produced only in the Hadriacum lowlands. "Sit down," commanded the chief in a high, piping voice. Fancher swallowed and sat, facing his superior across the big desk. The chief opened a drawer, took out another of the long cigars, and handed it to Fancher. Fancher did not like cigars, but he had never dared say so to the chief. He lit it gingerly, coughed at his first inhalation, and smoked at it dutifully and unhappily. "You recognize this man certainly as Dark Kensington?" asked the chief. "Well," Fancher began, and started coughing again. The chief fixed him with an unwinking green stare. When the coughing spell ended, Fancher sat silent, his eyes stinging with tears, fumbling at what he wanted to say. "You knew Dark Kensington before his disappearance 25 years ago," said the chief, with a trace of impatience in his tone. "I am told that you saw this man and talked to him. You are qualified to recognize Dark Kensington. Is the man Dark Kensington or not?" "Well," said Fancher again, "the man was walking alone across the desert, and when someone picked him up, he asked how he could find the Childress Barber College, and of course our men heard of it and went out to—" "I have received a full report on the man's appearance and our initial contact with him. I asked you a question." "Well, Chief, it's a peculiar thing. If this man, as he is now, had reappeared 25 years ago, I know it was Dark Kensington. But he looks exactly as Dark did when he disappeared, not one day older. And he doesn't remember a thing beyond his disappearance, except events of the past 2 weeks, he says. Yet his memories of Dark's activities before his disappearance are unquestionably accurate and clear. It's as though Dark had been put on ice at the time of his disappearance and just now thawed out, without any aging or memory during the interim." "Perhaps he was," said the chief dryly. "But is it possible that this man, looking so much like Dark Kensington, could have studied Kensington's personality and activities carefully and be posing as Kensington?" "No, sir," said Fancher promptly. "Dark and I were very close friends at one time. He remembers that, although he had difficulty recognizing me since I'm so much older. We went through some experiences together that I never told to anyone, and I'm sure he didn't. He remembers them in every detail, like the way we trapped a sage rabbit once when we'd run out of supplies out in Hadriacum." Fancher chuckled. "Then we couldn't eat the thing," he reminisced. "Very well. If you're sure of his identity, that's all I wish to know," said the chief. "I don't want to be trapped by a Mars Corp trick with plastic surgery. But if this man is Dark Kensington, it's the best fortune the Phoenix has met with in a long time." He fell silent and busied himself with papers on his desk, paying no more attention to Fancher. Fancher waited, then concluded reasonably that the interview was at an end. And since the long cigar agonized him, he rose and moved quietly toward the door.
"I have not given you permission to leave," said the chief, without raising either his eyes or his voice. "Kensington is due to arrive in a few moments, and I want you here when I talk to him. If any of his words or actions appear inconsistent in any way to you, I want you to let me know."
Fancher sighed silently, returned to his chair, and puffed disconsolately on the cigar. Some 5 minutes passed. Then there was a firm rap on the door.
"Come in,"
called the chief in his reedy voice. The door opened, and in walked a man whose entire presence radiated strength, confidence, and the potentiality of instant violence. Dark Kensington was tall and broad-shouldered, clad in dark blue tunic and baggy trousers. His face was darkly tanned, strong, handsome. His hair was black as midnight. His eyes were startlingly pale in the dark face, eyes of pale blue, remote and filled with light. "I'm Dark Kensington," he said, striding up to the chief's desk. "You're the man known as the Chief?"
"Yes,"
answered the chief, and waited. Dark nodded to Fancher. Fancher, feeling rather green about the gills, returned the greeting. Dark turned his attention back to the chief, and he also waited. There was a long silence. The chief broke it first.
"What do you know about Dr. G.O.T. Hennessy, Goat Hennessy?" asked the chief calmly.
Fancher blinked at this unexpected line of questioning. A cloud passed over Dark's face, as though the name had triggered something in him that he could not quite remember. "He was a very good friend of mine," answered Dark, "although it seems that something happened between us that I can't quite recollect. He was one of the most brilliant geneticists of Earth, and came to Mars with an experimental group that was trying to develop a human type that could live more comfortably under Martian conditions. The project was backed by the government." He stopped. It was the chief who added, "Then Mars Corp stepped in." The expression on Dark's face was blank. "You don't know what Mars Corp is, do you?" asked the chief curiously. "The name's familiar," replied Dark. "It's a space line, isn't it?" "If your amnesia is genuine, you might very well react in such a fashion," said the chief reflectively. "Mars Corp is the Mars Corporation, and it's the only space line that serves Mars now. It's a giant combine on Earth, which has a virtual monopoly on the space lines and exports and imports between Earth and all the colonized planets. Mars Corp is against any development of human beings who can live under natural extraterrestrial conditions, because that would end the colony's dependence on Mars Corp for supplies. As it is, the colonies literally can't live without Mars Corp. Mars Corp controls enough senators and delegates in the World Congress to block other important projects if the Earth government refuses to cooperate with it. So the government, that is to say Mars Corp, put a ban on the experiments by Hennessy and other scientists here." "I remember the government ban on the projects, but I wasn't aware that Mars Corp had anything to do with it," said Dark. "Goat Hennessy was one of a group of us who retired to the desert to continue work despite the government ban." "Goat sold out," said the chief. "Perhaps your memory doesn't include that important point, but Fancher remembers it well. It was a little before my time. Goat sold out and betrayed the others to the government in return for assistance in carrying out more limited experiments. Some of the group escaped and formed the nucleus of the rebel movement, which now is centered here at the Childress Barber College. We call ourselves the Order of the Phoenix." The chief allowed himself the luxury of a very faint smile. "Mars Corp and the government call us the Desert Rats," he said. "Very appropriate. They consider us in the same category as rats." Dark had been standing, casually at ease, before the chief's desk, with the air of a man who does not tire from standing. Now he did something Fancher would not have dared. Without the chief's invitation, Dark sat down in a comfortable chair, leaned back, and stretched out his legs in relaxation. "It's a little hard for me to realize there's a 25-year gap in my memory," he said. "It seems to me that it has been less than a month ago that Goat and I were together, with other refugees from the government edict in the Icaria desert. Why did you ask me about Goat?"
"Because the government brought him back to Mars City not 3 months ago," answered the chief. "None of us had any idea where he was, but it turns out that the government has had him working under surveillance someplace in the Xanthi Desert north of Solus Lacus. Since it was not far from Solus Lacus that you were picked up, I wondered if you had had any contact with him."
"Not that I remember," said Dark. "Do you have another of those cigars?"
"Why, yes," answered the chief, startled.
He produced another Hadriacum cigar and handed it to Dark. Dark lit it and puffed the fragrant smoke with evident enjoyment. "As I say, the last time I remember seeing Goat was in the Icaria desert, in a dome we had set up there," said Dark. "The next thing I remember is waking up in the midst of some sort of cave in a different part of Icaria, surrounded by Martians. I could communicate with them in a fashion, something I was never able to do before, and they were able to write the name of the Childress Barber College so I could read it. But they evidently don't differentiate our dome cities by name. I had no idea the college was here in Mars City until your men contacted me. I just assumed it was at Solus Lacus."
"You'd have waged a merry search for it clear on the other side of Mars," remarked the chief. "What was your purpose in finding it?"
"I don't know that I had any specific purpose," replied Dark easily. "I gathered from the Martians that here I could find someone who concurred with my philosophy of resisting the government edict against seeking self-sufficiency on Mars, and this was more or less confirmed by your 2 men who contacted me at Solus Lacus."
"I'll see to it that in the future they're not quite so frank until they're sure of their man," said the chief darkly. He looked quizzically at Fancher, and Fancher nodded slightly. "But it's true. It's a matter of fact. The Phoenix follows the path toward self-sufficiency that you recommended, rather than the one sought by Goat Hennessy."
"That's the wrong way to approach it," said Dark promptly. "Goat and the other scientists were following a line offering valid possibilities in their genetic research. The only reason the rest of us chose to attempt the extrasensory powers, particularly teleportation, was that we were not qualified in genetic research, and this seemed a field in which we stood a chance to contribute along alternate lines. The effort should be followed along both lines."
"The government managed to capture all the scientists at the time of your disappearance, and it was assumed that you had been captured too," said the chief. "We don't have any scientists in the Phoenix who are capable of doing Goat Hennessy's type of research."
"You say he's in Mars City. I wonder if it would do any good for me to contact him."
"I told you that he was the one who betrayed the whole thing to the government, and he's been working under government supervision these last 25 years. I wouldn't trust him."
The chief surveyed Dark's strong face with speculative green eyes, then added,
"As a matter of fact, we've made a certain amount of progress following your line of research. Since there are probably a good many things you discovered in this work that we haven't stumbled on yet, we could use your help in developing it, if you're interested."
"Very definitely," answered Dark. "I'm interested in seeing what you've done, and I'll be glad to help in any way I can."
"There's one thing," said the chief, measuring his words. "I've held this organization together despite some pretty severe reverses for more than 15 years now. The reason I've been able to do it is that I expect and must insist on absolute obedience to my orders."
Dark smiled. "I said that I would be willing to help you," he replied gently. "I follow no man's orders." The green eyes fixed themselves unwinkingly on the pale blue ones for a long moment. The blue ones did not waver. At last, to Fancher's utter amazement, the chief nodded agreement. End of Chapter 4.